Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another in a series of videos where I'll be teaching you Crusader Kings 2. Today, we're taking a look at character stats and internal development. So, in the previous few videos, we talked about managing an empire internally, keeping your vassals loyal, keeping the governments of the proper type. I will talk about vassal loyalty and how to manage it a little bit in the future video dedicated to vassals, but we talked about the empire and your country as a whole. We also talked about wars and external threats that might threaten your empire, and how to defend against those, how terrain matters, how to wage war, when to assault holdings, when to not, how influential mercenaries can be. Displayed this rather well in the conquest of England in 1066. But today, we're staying home. Today we're not concerned with the intricacies of politics and courts and foreign courts and dukes and kings and whatnot. Today we're staying literally home. We're going to be taking a look at your character, his stats, and we're going to be taking a look at improvements in your own capital and your own personal holdings. So, let's begin. I will start with the Serene Doge Pietro the 12th of Venice in the 1220 start. But the things I will talk about today will apply to any character anywhere, pretty much, regardless of the government type. So, this is a rather general tutorial, as the reason I'm saying this is various holdings will have various upgrades, which is something we're going to talk about a bit later, but the stuff we're going to talk about today is pretty general and just stuff that applies to everyone, everywhere, pretty much. So, let's begin with character stats. Most people know pretty much everything about them, right? Point being, the more you have of them, the better you're off, right? This is certainly correct. The more stats or the more points you have in stats, the better your character is, and overall, the better situation you are in. How do you manipulate these stats? Well, you don't really. They're more or less of a genetic thing. You can manipulate the stats of your heir by marrying the proper person, which Doge Pietro has actually done a decent job at doing. But basically, the stats you're given change fairly little throughout the course of your life. What can change them is the focus tree, and it can change them by as much as 3 in a particular stat that you would like. So, let's begin with the question, what do each of these stats do? Sure, having more of them is important and is good, but what do they, actually do? All of them individually, and this is something that a lot of people miss out on a few things that these stats do. In general, most people have a pretty good idea of what these stats do within the first few weeks of the game, or within the first few days of the game. However, these go pretty damn deep. This is what is used to calculate most decisions, except for the ones that are completely random, in Crusader Kings 2. These influence a lot more than people give them credit for. So, let's begin with the art of diplomacy. First of all, there are 2 types of diplomacy: state diplomacy and personal diplomacy. Personal diplomacy is based on the base of the diplomacy score and the traits that affect it, whereas state diplomacy is based on the personal diplomacy of the king, or your character in this case, his spouse, and his counselors. Okay? What's the difference between the two? State diplomacy is pretty abstract and is influential in some ways, and obviously the more of it you have, the better it is. This is sort of the general rule for every stat ever, but in general, personal diplomacy you tend to pay a lot more attention to. Side note, we talked about the council in the basics of the game, and the first few things that you do is appoint counselors in this game. We talked about this. We want your counselors to be very good at their jobs, but we also want your powerful vassals to be on the council so as to avoid any issues that might ensue. So we talked about how to change positions. So this guy's terrible at intrigue. We don't want him to be the spy master. So let's say we go over here and we say change council position. You are the new Chancellor, because you're very good at diplomacy. Him, for example, he's terrible at Intrigue. He's terrible at Intrigue also, so everyone on the council is terrible at Intrigue. Fair enough. But we talked about this already. What about personal diplomacy? Well, personal diplomacy, one of the most direct things that it influences, and full disclaimer, yes, this video will go through each and every one of these stats explaining what their primary functions are. I may miss out on something because there are quite a few, and like I said, the game is more or less based around these numbers. If you ever played Dungeons and Dragons or something along those lines, you will know that pretty much everything your character does is based around the numbers you create that character. So his strength, his agility, his dexterity, stuff like that. Think of these like that. Most decisions you make will factor these in one way or another. Some won't at all, but most of them will. So, let's begin with diplomacy. The most immediate thing that diplomacy is used for is if you mouse over an opinion of one of your vassals. Your diplomacy, or rather the state diplomacy, will increase the opinion of vassals based on its value. How this value is calculated, you can go online and check the exact arithmetics behind it, but general rule applies. The more of it you have, the better. Okay? Now, what else does diplomacy influence? Oddly enough, not that much. Obviously, the more of it you have, the more people will like you in general. This can sometimes be overestimated, can sometimes be also underestimated. If your character is utterly terrible at diplomacy, you might get characters around you being a little bit hesitant to deal with you. As you can see, our state diplomacy currently isn't that great. It's sort of average, and our personal diplomacy isn't that good either. We did the corrosing focus, which increased it by 3, but even then, it's not that great. So, let's say we want to talk to the Doge, or the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and we want to ask him for something, right? His opinion of us is +1. That's due to state diplomacy. State diplomacy is really influential when it comes to dealing with outsiders that don't really know you, or don't really have anything good or bad to say against you. Here's the thing. I can't really influence his opinion of me that much. I could send him a gift if I gather up 1 billion gold. I can arrange a marriage between us, but even that he has to agree to, so my options for changing his opinion of me are rather limited. My vassals, I have a lot more options there. I can give them honorary titles, I can send them gifts which are cheaper, I can invite them to corrosing with this focus, I could buy favors from them, I could give them titles to like me, all sorts of things really. I can improve my relationship with them with the improved relationship thing. Mind you, that you can do this with foreigners as well, but you know, it really targets only one person rather than the whole. So diplomacy is important for keeping opinion of people high. Does it influence much more than that? Not really. Not that much. Well, until we get up here. You see, up here is where these stats have the most direct influence mathematically. And I'm going to talk about these really quickly. What am I talking about? Demesne size, vassal limit, and that's about it. I mean, yes, gold, prestige, and piety as well, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So my current stat increases my monthly prestige by 0.01. If this were, let's say, 30 diplomacy, the increase would be higher. So, what does diplomacy actually influence in terms of the numbers up here? Like I said, this is where you get the most direct effect. Well, it influences vassal limit. Vassal limit is the number of vassals you can have directly under you. There is a golden rule in medieval Europe and the medieval world, really. The vassal of my vassal is nothing to me. So, this only counts the vassals directly under your control. We can have 10 from our laws, Serene Doge rank gives you a base of 15. The game's base is 1, regardless of where you're at. And rural diplomacy bonus is 4. If we had more diplomacy, this thing would be higher. Immediately, this doesn't really concern us. We're a doge of, what, 2 republics? This doesn't concern us, like I said, that much. But it does concern the Holy Roman Emperor. It will concern someone who conquers a large amount of territory. Next is Marshal. Now, Marshal is king. Well, kind of. Marshal is very important in that a low Marshal score is catastrophic. Why so? Well, for one, you're terrible in combat. That's always a negative thing. Your character will always be able to lead his own armies unless something extraordinary happens, like he gets injured, he gets sick, or maimed, or well, actually not even maimed. Even maimed characters can lead armies, but if he gets like seriously injured to the point where he can't stand, you know, stuff like that. And hell, even that didn't stop certain historical characters. But point being, that makes you bad at combat. That makes you bad at personal duels, which can occur every now and again. But very importantly, it also lowers the amount of men you can raise. This is not something that becomes very obviously available, well, ever, really. This isn't something that you can really easily check by pressing one button. But essentially, the higher your martial score, the more men you will be able to raise. What kind of men? Men from your personal demesne, not of your vassals. The amount of men you can raise from your vassals depends on their opinion of you. So, a vassal with a negative opinion of you will give you fewer men. Vassal with a very high opinion of you will give you all of his men. Well, not all of his men, but a larger percentage of his men. Okay? Personal demesne, though, and as you can see, this is especially relevant for those starting with smaller titles, and for those... I mean, honestly, this is... If you play it right, this is relevant always, because your personal demesne should always be high. Why? We'll get into this when I talk about managing the vassals and keeping the empire intact, or the kingdom, or whatever. They're keeping the primary title intact and not dealing with rebellions and discouraging them rather than anything else. But keeping a high personal demesne makes your entire country more stable. The more men you have, the more power you have. This is fairly simple. Why is that relevant? Well, if you go over to the tab over here, you will notice threats. Threats are basically rebellious vassals, though certain other things can be threats as well. But threats are essentially rebellious vassals. The more men you have, the lower someone's threat is, essentially. If you have no men and someone with 100 soldiers comes knocking on your door, suddenly he's right whatever he's going to say, right? Because he has 100 men more than you do. But if you have 7,000 men and he has 100 and he knocks on your door, suddenly he feels the urge to run away. Same goes for vassals, pretty much. For all of the vassals. If this guy, for example, were to become particularly rebellious of me, he holds only the city of Istra. He has 1,000 men. I have 7,000. Might is right, essentially. Because I outnumber him so heavily, he will be very hesitant towards joining rebellions, very hesitant towards being a pain in the rear. However, if he had more men than me, quite the contrary. So, this is something that Marshal also influences very directly. A lot of the times when your character dies and your son inherits you, you will notice a drop in the number of men you can have from your demesne. So, a lot of people will go, well, where the hell did my men go? And we'll try and find an explanation for it, and we'll try and build upgrades in the cities and the castles that they hold, and we'll go, well, you know, must be some way I can influence this. Well, yes and no. Yes and no. It's mostly due to Marshal being low. Right. Is there anything else that the Marshal score the martial score influences. Kind of, but for things like piety and prestige and money, well, we'll talk about money in a bit. For things like prestige and piety, you can mouse over them and directly read exactly what's influencing your monthly gain or monthly loss of those things. So I won't talk about these because you can literally just look at them and see what's happening. For example, you'll see that the diplomacy skill we have is increasing our monthly diplomacy, our monthly prestige, sorry, by 0.22. Being a duke increases it. Some of the buildings that we have increase it. The proud trait increases it as well, so on and so forth. But these are the things you can look at for yourself depending on the situation. So we'll skip over these two. Now we go over to stewardship. Well, actually, not yet. Let me say something else about Marshall that I forgot. Marshall only, like I said, influences the amount of men you can raise from your Demesne. It doesn't influence the amount of men you can raise from your vassals. However, your vassal's martial score influences the amount of men they have available. In other words, if a vassal has a very, very low martial score, he's not very good at his job. Essentially, you want your vassals to be very good in their stats as well. Problem being, you can't really choose them. I mean, the Count of Istra is a pretty bad character, right? I could push to revoke his title. This would incur some penalties, so I would have to do it through a plot. However, it would make him hate me, and I would have to give it to someone else. Someone that's a very good vassal. What happens when he dies? What if his son is even more terrible than the Count of Istra? This level of micromanagement you don't really tend to do because it's not worth it. You spend a lot more time fighting the county rather than benefiting from it. Let's just say that if I keep raising Istra over and over again to put it in the hands of a proper vassal, the best vassal won't do a lot in this situation because, well, the place has been raised so many times, right? So, that level of micromanagement I don't recommend ever. However, do bear in mind that a vassal with a high amount of martial has a high amount of men available at his command. The more men he has available at his command, the more men he is obligated to give you, regardless of his opinion of you. And of course, the higher his opinion, the more men he will actually give you. There you go. What am I talking about? You can actually check the ratios and the numbers in the laws. Right now, the noble minimum levy that a vassal has to provide is 40%. He has to give me 40% of his men. If he likes me, he will give me more. Right. There we go. So, the same rule really applies for his vassals as well. So it's a system that goes all the way down to mayors and bishops and barons. Right? So, again, this guy's martial score dictates how many men he will have available, and it's a calculation that goes all the way up to the sovereign ruler. Right. Now, on to stewardship. Something that we horribly lack in this situation, and that's very important. Well, I mean, all these stats are sort of important, apart from learning, but forget about that real quickly. We'll get to that. Stewardship. This dictates the national tax modifier. The more stewardship you have, the more taxes you are able to raise, the more money you have. Raw, unadulterated money. Right? You want this to be pretty high, but that's not the only reason. Again, the same applies for vassals. The higher the stewardship he has, the more money he can earn for himself, the more money he's obliged to pay to you, if the laws dictated that he pays any. Right? So, the higher their stewardship is, the more money they pay to you. Now, what also dictates stewardship? Or what does stewardship also dictate? Demesne limit. This is the amount of holdings you can personally own. depending on what character you are and what type your government is, because these can be either churches, mosques, being pretty much the same category of thing, cities, or castles. My apologies for the interruption. So, this is also something dictated by state stewardship. Obviously, the more Demesne you control personally, the more men you will have, and the more money you will have as a general rule of thumb, because it's always better to control something yourself rather than have the income for it and the men for it mediated through someone else. Right, so, is that everything regarding stewardship? Well, basically yes, but is it not enough? It dictates economy, pretty much, which is why there's a coffer next to it, and it dictates pretty much two of the most important things you will have, and two of the things that are relevant consistently from the first minute of the game to the last second that you play through a playthrough. So, is it not enough? Intrigue, the way of the shadow, the way of the spy master, the way of the cloak and dagger, the backstabbing art. What does it entail? Well, plot success, assassination success, covert actions of any sorts. Period. That's about it. Intrigue doesn't dictate much in the political life. It doesn't bring you more men, it doesn't bring you more gold. But what it does do is dictate how easy and how, or on the flip side, how difficult it would be to succeed in a plot to do, well, anything. The initial plot power depends on your capabilities. This is useful for plots, obviously. This is also useful depending on your game settings. This is also useful when dealing with direct assassinations that you pay for, like so. And stuff similar to that, basically. There's really just any sort of covert action that you want to do that is dependent on it. Also, something slightly less covert, but also falls under the same rule. Where is it? Imprisonment, but I'm not allowed to imprison anyone. Let me change that really quickly. Perhaps not, perhaps yes. Well, later we'll be able to change that, but yes, imprisonment. The chance you have to imprison someone is also dictated by this. It's not very intriguey, but because you sort of, barge in there with men, but yeah, that also falls under intrigue. What now? I said this is the way of the spy master, right? Each of these stats are relevant for one of your counselors. However, when it comes to the state diplomacy, it is calculated based on all of your counselors, and there is a formula for it. So what I'm saying is, state diplomacy is not only based on his diplomacy as the counselor, it is based on the entire council. And the mathematical formula for calculating it is rather complicated, but it's a formula that you can't really change. You can change the numbers that go into it by having better counselors, but you can't really change the formula itself, so it's not that relevant, and it's... honestly, I don't know it by heart, neither should you. Doesn't matter. Not really. So, the way of the spy master. If you are a spy master, or on the other hand, you have a spy master, intrigue is also very important for him. Essentially, it dictates his capability of scheming, sabotaging, building a spy network, or studying technology. Pretty much influences all four of these. The higher his intrigue, the more successful he will be. The same rule applies to pretty much everyone. So bear in mind, we talked about how important it is to have good counselors, but also to have powerful vassals as your counselors in order to stop them from rebelling. Just bear in mind that these stats influence these actions here as well, not just them as a character or their realm. Good. Now we get to the last one, and nobody's favourite, learning. Contrary to popular belief, this doesn't have anything to do with education. with studying, with, you know, learning. Trying to avoid that word, but I really can't. It does have something to do with it. If you join a society and you acquire a certain amount of items, some of them will require a certain amount of learning points in order to be usable, essentially. But that's the only relationship learning has with, well, learning. Learning is a church skill, okay? Learning has nothing to do with your education, with your diplomatic capability, that's diplomacy, with your intrigue, with your stewardship, those are all separate. Learning is essentially, other than those items, how well you pray. That's about it. Like I said, not much to do with education. Learning has also precious little to do with teaching your son how to do stuff. You can have 0 learning and teach your son to become a masterful tactician if you are a masterful tactician. Right? Learning, you will obviously, if you have 0 learning, chances are your son isn't going to have a lot either, but that also, you know, depends on quite a few roles, and he can, but usually not. What does learning influence? Well, mouse over piety, and I'm pretty sure it's somewhere in there. There you go, 0.38 monthly learning. Anything other than that? No. I mean, not really. You will find the odd thing here and there, maybe in the decisions, maybe in a special event, but not really. It will... Actually, no, it won't even do that, will it? I thought it might increase your opinion increase the opinion of the head of religion, but it doesn't even do that. It used to at one point. Maybe you have a extraordinarily high learning, it might, but I honestly don't think so. So there you go. That's about it. Does it increase the church opinion, or the opinion of religious vassals? No, that's diplomacy. That's still diplomacy. Learning is, I hate to say it, kind of the least useful one out of all of them. Now, there are situations where you might find this to be good. And I'm going to get to those exquisite characters in a bit. Essentially, again, I'm repeating this for like the millionth time, but it's relevant, trust me. The more of these points you have, any of them, the better you're off, obviously. For the reasons already explained, but for one extra one as well. If you have a ridiculously high diplomacy score, you will be able to use a special hidden diplomatic option when dealing with some events. How do you get an astronomically high diplomatic score? You don't. Genetics, having the proper wife, having good luck, having a good education, but that's dice rolls as well, so you can hedge your bets to have a higher likelihood of having a good diplomacy score, but ultimately whether it's going to be astronomically high or average is down to the dice rolled. I mean, most things are in this case, but regardless, sometimes you'll have characters that are ridiculously good at one of these stats. Most of the time, these stats will be average, but sometimes you'll get a genius, right? Not with a trade, but with points. Though one does influence the other. At any rate, if you have an exceedingly high score in any of these, you will occasionally get special prompts for events. Listen carefully. Most of the time, you want to click the special prompt. Study the event, study the consequences, read them. If you've never seen the event, I thoroughly recommend that you read through the entire thing and not just skip through it, regardless of what you think about it, and how insignificant it may seem. Read through it once, and then you'll know what to do every single time, right? Personally, I don't read events in CK2 anymore. I know what each and every one of them say based on the options given to me as a response. But for your first few times, do read the events. You'll get a better understanding of how and why. Especially read the consequences of clicking any of the actions, because sometimes it's worded like one thing, but nothing actually happens. For example, charging a vassal with slandering you, which is something that you will often see as a result of court politics, basically, will lower his opinion of you and give you a reason to imprison him. This won't do anything else, though. It will make the vassal hate you, you'll have a reason to imprison him. he'll still be your vassal, he'll still have the same amount of men. If you don't want to piss him off and imprison him, don't slander him. Right? This might seem obvious at first, but in the heat of the moment you might click the wrong thing. So, why did I mention that particular thing? Well, in certain situations, you will be able to pick a third or fourth option. Sometimes, if this is a high intrigue, or a high stewardship, or high diplomacy thing, it will allow you for some in-between answers, or some extremely beneficial answers. Or it will let you bribe people, which will make them dislike you a little bit, but it will give you money. Again, read through them, but just know that if you have a lot of something here, not the state one, the personal one, you'll have special abilities. Kind of like Batman. Okay, moving on to personal demesne. Like I said, we're not leaving home this entire episode. What is personal demesne? Very simple. Things you control directly. Not your vassals, not someone else, not someone you appointed. Things you control. How many of them you have? Dictated by this number. What do you do with them? Well, they provide you with money, they provide you with men. They also kind of provide you with the prestige and piety, depending on what you have, but that's falls a little bit on the wayside. Primary resources are money and men. The two M's, if you will. So, clicking on a city that you own, a temple that you own, or a barony that you own, doesn't matter, they're all more or less the same. These provide the most amount of soldiers, these provide the most amount of taxes, these provide somewhere in between of both. That's the only difference between them. As a republic, we naturally like to control cities. These give us some men, but a lot of money. As you can see, I have 2 republics and an income of 79 ducats. The Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the entire thing, has an income of 73. I have more money than the Emperor of the HRE, and I control 2 or 3 provinces. How? Cities. I control cities, I control trade. I'm Doge Venice. Sup. Okay, I'm here to talk to you about one very specific thing within personal demesne. Upgrading it. To do that, I'm not going to take a look at our capital city because it's upgraded to high hell already. Let's take a look at something less important. Well, slightly less important. When and how much, and do you at all, upgrade your personal holdings? Yes, yes, by God, yes. Now, bear in mind, money is a thing that comes and goes, but it will decide your fate many times. Right now, I have 2,000 ducats. What do I do with that money? Well, I'm not going to spend it on mercenaries. At the very least, I'm not going to spend all of it on mercenaries. Hire a mercenary band, the biggest one, costs 450 ducats, and their monthly maintenance is 82. So let's say I keep around 1,000 in reserve, just in case the HRE decides to attack me, or anyone else. I have 960 to spend. Obviously, if I have rebellious vassals, I could grant them gifts and make them less rebellious. Or I can, do something else in order to appease them. But you do need to spend your money on upgrading your cities, your castles, or your churches, depending on what you have. So, let's take a look at why. Well, it will depend on, again, the holding, but as a whole, for example, city walls will increase my levy, my taxes, and my fort level. All good things. Fort level increase means it's harder to siege down. Taxes, no prize for guessing what that gives. Levy increase by 5%. That's a decent number considering this provides with 1,700 men. 5% of that is decent. It's relatively cheap. So we're going to upgrade the walls. People often ask the question, what do I upgrade first? I can't give you a direct answer to this because it will depend on a variety of factors, the primary one being technology. Technology dictates what you can build in your cities. Technology varies from county to county, it's not a global thing, it's not a country thing. So this is the technology in my capital. If I were to click here, or not click here, but if I were to mouse over here, this is the technology in this county. How do you increase it? You don't. Not really. There are two ways of increasing it. These guys, they all have a research tech ability. This guy can actually study foreign technology and steal it. But yeah, these four actually have something related to tech. Or universities, which you build later. They increase the technology spread rate, and yeah, there you go. Technology increases through time on its own, mind you. On its own, it will just increase, regardless of your input. Bear that in mind. So, what do you build first? Well, again, it depends on what you need. You're going to need to analyze your situation, both politically, from the outside and from the inside. I have a load of money, right? And I have a very big income, and I don't have a lot of things to spend that money on. The number of holdings I have is limited, the number of vassals I have is limited. The number of things I can spend money on through decisions is also rather limited. I can search for a smith and get some of the finest jewels in the land and spend 2,000 ducats on them, but after that, you know, I'll still have a pretty high income. Right now, in this situation, we need soldiers. So we're going to focus our upgrading on getting more soldiers where we can. So a barracks is good. City fortifications, useless, so we're not going to build it. Again, city fortifications. It's an island. If it gets sieged, plus 0.5% isn't going to really help that much. And what about this one? This one will help. It increases retinue size. This one increases levy size and taxes. So, you know what? Let's go and build that as well. This is, by the way, exclusive to republics, so if you don't have this, fear not. Okay? Now, what about if you were in a different situation? Well, in a different situation, maybe you let's say you need money. Then you sort of want to build stuff that gives you money. Bearing in mind, it costs money to upgrade stuff. So if you want to upgrade stuff in order to get more money, you see the sort of paradox here. It's an investment, and it returns through time. You lose a county, obviously it doesn't return to its full potential, but provided you keep the county under direct control, it sort of is a return investment, right? But over time. Kind of like investing money in agriculture. Eventually you'll take it back, you know, it will pay back to you, but it'll take time. So, what about the actual buildings that you're supposed to build? There are a few tips of advice I can give you, but again, it's situational. Here's an advice. If you need troops, build castle walls first. There's a reason for this. This says levy size plus 10. Now, you might think that if you give yourselves a barracks first, because a barracks gives a flat amount of men, so it doesn't give a percentage of men, it gives a flat amount of men, that it's better to build a barracks first, then castle walls. Doesn't matter. It stacks, right? So if you have 100 men now, and this gives 10% of those men, plus extra, you have 110 men. If you then build a barracks, and you have 200 men, and this gives 10% extra, you now have 220 men. They stack on top of each other. Order at which you build them does not matter. So build the ones that are most useful and cheapest first. Castle walls are one of the cheapest ways of increasing your men, increasing your defenses, and doing all of that to a larger degree than most things below it. And is cheap, and gets finished quickly. So castle walls first if you're looking for men. Everything else, whatever you want. If you want cavalry, build cavalry. If you want heavy infantry, build heavy infantry. This will depend on the sort of men you field. So let's take a look at this army. This is a very well balanced army, right? It has a little bit of everything. In your situation, and especially in earlier years, you will find that you have more light infantry than you have heavy infantry. Heavy infantry is generally better. So, you might want to build a barracks, and that will give you more heavy infantry. Remember something though. Unless you have an astronomical amount of money, and you can get into those situations. Example, I started from the earliest date possible, and in 1050 I had around 10,000 gold as the Emperor of Sweden. Mind you, Sweden was about that big at the time. So with 10,000 gold, you can spend it on whatever the hell you want. You're still going to have more of it. And I was constantly raiding Constantinople as well. That place is a treasure trove of just stuff. So, that being said, unless you have an astronomical amount of gold, you don't bother with upgrading your vassals' stuff. Usually. If you have nothing else to upgrade, you might want to go down to upgrade your vassals and your barons and your mayors' cities and stuff like that. But, again, if you don't have anything to upgrade, stockpile the money until you do. Stockpile the money for, you know, the event that you might at one point need mercenaries or anything like that. Okay, there we go. What about churches and cities? Same thing. Really, same thing. It depends on what you need at the moment. But they have similar upgrades. Shipyards, walls, barracks, stuff like that. Cities, again, more focused on taxes than anything else, but similar, very similar to each other. Okay, good. So, that's about it, isn't it? As far as personal development is concerned. When do you develop it? When you have the money for it. How will you know? Well, you just will. Just look at the situation around you. So, for example, right now, I know that the HRE is dangerous because it can attack me. I want to keep a stash of mercenaries. They have 35,000 men. I have 8,000. That's not good for me, is it? So I want to have a lot of money stockpiled in case I need to use it in a war. Anything that goes above the stockpile limit I'm pleased with, I will invest, either in getting personal artifacts or building upgrades. Or a little bit of both. See, a good strategy is to not focus on one thing. So I did just hire the smith to give me something. To build me something. And fair enough, I will get my item. Depends on how much money I pay for it, the quality of the item will vary. The more I pay for it, the better it will be. Usually, I guess, you know, unless he screws you over entirely, which is rare. But a good strategy is to invest a little bit in development, a little bit in managing your vassals and keeping them happy, a little bit in mercenaries, or you know, a little bit of a bank to sort of you'll hear this term quite a lot in the future, a war chest. It's a special chest full of gold that you use only when you're at war. It doesn't really exist, it's imaginary, but the gold should stay there in reserve, right? But investing a little bit in development, a little bit over here, a little bit over there is usually a pretty good tactic. In other words, not putting all your eggs in one basket. Whew! Alright, there we go. That's about it. If you have any questions regarding development of provinces, technology, anything that this video covered, please feel free to ask me down in the comments below, and I will explain it as best as I physically can. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, please remember to like and subscribe down below if you enjoyed this video and want to stay tuned with the rest of the series. I forgot to talk about hospitals. Damn it. 2 seconds. Hospitals are a new thing. Most tutorials don't talk about them. Is it for a reason? Not really. Hospitals are sort of useful. I tend to build them in my capital exclusively, maybe in a few provinces around the capital. They increase disease resistance, and that's about it. Generally speaking, you don't want your country to fall victim to a disease. You don't want your court and your capital to fall victim to a disease, especially because that increases the chance of your character contracting that disease. building a hospital reduces that risk by like 10, 20, 30%, depending on how much you invest in it and how much technology you have. Doesn't provide men. Is it useful? Yes. Again, only if you have a lot of money. Bearing in mind, if you lack money and you have outstanding issues that need fixing, wars, disloyal vassals, something like that, focus your money on that. If you don't, and you have money, this is what you dump it in. Think of development as a way of dumping extra money you don't need. Or, even better, as another way of dumping extra money you need that, once invested, will stay there forever. So, a barracks, once built, will be a barracks for all of eternity, for all of the generations to come. Investment is a very good way of... or investing in development is a very good way of ensuring that a certain amount of power is built up. Especially if you keep all of the counties that you start off with towards the later stages of the game. There you go. That's why it's a good thing, because sending a gift to a vassal will make him like you temporarily. Building a barracks and building, you know, an extra 2,000 men will make all your vassals slightly more terrified with you for the rest of eternity, provided you keep the territory and the castles in which those were built. Right. There we go. I believe I've now covered officially everything. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe down below if you enjoyed the video and want to stay tuned with the rest of the series and with the rest of the content that I produce on this channel. Until next time, my name has been Juggernaut. Have fun, take care, and bye-bye.